So we're going to do a couple of things today. The first is speech acts, and the second is cooperative principle. The way we're going to do it is by looking at studies that have been done. Some good studies, Cheng, which is Dr. Cheng, your Dr. Cheng. This was a study that came out in 2017, this year. Awesome study. It's fantastic. And she did a great job. It's in a fantastic journal, and we're very proud. And you're going to look at some of it. Nelson is a problematic study. This was actually the chair of my department in Georgia State, so I know her very well. And we're going to look at why it's a problematic study. Then we're also going to look at Wolfson. Nessa Wolfson was basically the grandmother of pragmatics in ESL. And her academic daughter was my advisor, Dr. Boxer, Diana Boxer, at the University of Florida. And then, so that makes me Nessa Wolfson's granddaughter. So Dr. Boxer and I wrote an article in 1995 that specifically addresses problems with ESL speech acts in ESL, speech acts in ESL. And those 4 articles are available to you. Shihun has uploaded them. So if after going through this today, you have more interest in reading through them, which I hope you will, they're a really good read for you to go and get real familiar with the idea of this type of research in pragmatics. But we're going to start with a little activity. So I'm going to divide you into, and what Shihun is going to knock this out, just knock this part out. But for those of you that are online, the activity will be available to you online, so you can have a look at it. We'll upload the activity, but we're going to stop and do the activity as 2 groups, okay? So I'm going to ask, Attilio, bear with me. I'm so sorry. I didn't upload this beforehand. No problem. It's just going to be about 5 minutes while the students work on it, and then, but my apologies. That's entirely my fault.
No, absolutely, no problem. There's no reason to apologize. No.
Because
okay, so we're done. That's
other pieces they don't have.
Okay, so we're who are you going to give it to? Amanda. So okay, so we're done now with the activity. So we're going to talk about it for a second. So okay, who won? Who got the most? Oh, you're tied. Okay, Naomi and Diego tied, and you two got very good, very good. Okay, what does this activity have to do with pragmatics? What have you been doing for each other?
You're learning.
Yeah, what are you doing? What are you doing? What's
You're picking up more context.
Yeah, what? What exactly?
We're communicating, and we are trying to cooperate. And
what speech act do you do?
Oh, advising.
Yes, good. That's okay. It's like, what's she asking me? Guess what's inside her head? Inside my head is, yes, what you're doing is giving each other advice, which is a speech act. So, pragmalinguistically, I heard a few different ways in which you were doing that. Can you remember some of the things you were using?
If I were you.
If I were you.
I would suggest.
I would suggest. I recommend.
My experience.
In my experience. Okay, you also said you should.
Yeah.
Somebody back here said you could. So pragmalinguistically, you're getting all this practice on how you do this particular speech act, right? So what did you think? Did you enjoy the activity? Fun?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, so let's keep that activity in mind while we talk about ESL and the kinds of activities that you do. Okay. So let's do a really quick review of Dr. Hurtado's stuff. Some of the things you need to keep in mind for speech acts, started out with Austin, how to do things with words, performativity, so you're actually performing an act, the language that you're using performs an act. Does anyone remember what felicity conditions were?
Whether it's appropriate to be said at that time.
time.
Yeah, good. Okay, so the idea is not whether it matters whether it's true or false. The idea is, can you do it? You know, if I'm saying I marry Jihan and Amanda Kay, she's already married. Too bad. But you know, I can't perform that act anyway. The felicity conditions are not there. I can't. And also, you don't want to. Either of you don't want to, so the felicity conditions are not there. And then the distinction between locutionary, illocutionary, and perlocutionary. So with the activity we just did with giving advice, that's a speech act, right? So what was the locutionary stuff you were doing?
Words and stuff.
Yeah, the actual words. So that coincides with the pragmalinguistics, right? It's the actual words you use. You should. I recommend that you, etc. Okay. Illocutionary is, in this case, the advising. Okay. The force is I'm advising you to. That's what I'm doing. Perlocutionary in this case was whoever won the slip, whoever gave the best advice. That's all there. It's just a reminder to you. You can read this on your own. I'm not going to go through that again. Then Searle was the one that sort of put everything down in categories. So you've got expressives, commissives, and so on, all the different things that you can do with words. Ours comes under suggestions. And then this idea of indirect speech acts. So, can you pass the soul doesn't mean are you able to pass the soul? Do you have arms and hands? It means give me the soul, right? So please pass the soul, okay? Now, this is one area in which, and we'll have a look at examples of this, that non-native speakers struggle because indirect speech acts tend to conventionalize language. They tend to use certain conventional pragmalinguistic forms, okay? Think of something like, is the Pope Catholic, that we did, you know, before. So anybody who speaks American English knows that if I say, is the Pope Catholic, it means, yeah, of course, that's true, right? But what we'll see is that non-native speakers don't understand that at all. They think that maybe it has something to do with the Pope, right? So, because so much of indirect speech acts are done with idioms. Needless to say, this causes problems, right? And we're going to look at the research at a couple of the different problems that can occur, even if you pragmalinguistically are using the right kind of idea. It might be at the wrong time or with the wrong person. All right, so the first study we're going to look at is Dongmei Chang's, Dr. Chang, who teaches TESOL 2 here and a couple of other things. She starts off by saying the goal of speech act research is to describe the pragmalinguistic, socio-pragmatic features of speaker groups and to guide pragmatic instruction, right? Ultimately, to enhance cultural awareness and improve cross-cultural and intercultural communication, right? So in this study, she's looking at what we call a high-stakes situation, which in this case is an instructor's perceptions of student apologies, okay? So in this case, it's high stakes because if your instructor doesn't like you, that may cause some problems right down the line. So you want to try and make something like an apology, which has a lot of force, has a lot of pragmatic force. You're trying to express that you're sorry. If you get it wrong, it might not come out so well, right? So she took some real student apologies and she asked instructors what they thought of those apologies, right? So she included some email apologies, emails that students had sent to their instructors, and some what we call DCTs, which are discourse completion tests. And discourse completion test, you basically give a situation to the student, and you say, you are in this situation, you did this or you did that. What would you say to the instructor? And then they write down what they would do, or they tell you. It's either a spoken DCT, they tell you what they would do, or they write it. So it's realistic, but it's not real. All right, that's the difference. In American English, we usually have a 3-part structure of an apology, typically. The first is that you actually pragmalinguistically say, I'm sorry. You pick some way of saying, I'm sorry, and my bad, or whatever. The second one is you give a reason. You know, I was sick, my car broke down, and the third one is what resolution you would like to have. You know, is it possible for us to have another meeting, for example, even though I missed this meeting? Okay, that's a typical 3-part apology in American English, right? Typically what you would expect, or your hearer would expect. Okay, some of this I cut and pasted, so you're going to need to use your PowerPoint, but you don't need to read all this now. Basically, I just put in that she was saying these scenarios are considered crucial. In other words, it's a high-stakes situation because it may jeopardize the student's grade or ultimate success in the course. Thus, success or failure in apologizing has potentially a large influence on communication between instructors and their students. And the cultural differences unquestionably play a difference in how we apologize and what we apologize for. So if non-native speakers have got difficulties with that, this could come back and bite, right, for them. So what Dr. Chang did was have instructors, she put a bunch of scenarios, apologies, on Survey Gizmo, the online survey, like Survey Monkey, and she had them, had the instructors rate these apologies. So here's an example, here's an email example. Dear Professor Smith, I regrettably missed the lecture today and would like to make it up. Is there any way we could meet during your office hours so you can help me? If not, at the very least, email me the note so I can review it myself. Okay, so Amanda Kate, why are you laughing? What's the problem there?
At the very least.
Yes, yes. How does that make you feel?
Like, she's not expecting a whole lot from me.
Right. It's their bad, right? And they're like, you know, so what's this? Is this pragmalinguistic or sociopragmatic?
I guess it is both.
It's sort of both, yeah. But in any way, what's really bothering her is the this expression, right? This pragmalinguistic expression that's inappropriate in this situation because it's their bad, not yours. But it sounds like they're switching that around, right? Here's another one. Hi, Mr. Smith, how are you? Hope you have a nice day. I really email you because I've missed an important lecture. And as you know, the next 2 weeks will start final exams. I've seen all my friends. Nobody was taking notes or anything else. Would you mind repeat the lecture again or give me a brief summary of the lecture because I really need it as soon as possible to study for the exam?
That's not even an apology.
No. So for stars, says Jade, that's not even actually an apology. Right. More than anything, it sounds like a demand, right?
Yeah.
So,
And a little TMI.
a little TMI, what's that mean?
Too much information. Like I talked to my friends, but they actually didn't take it.
You just repeat the information.
Yeah. It would be like one of you emailing one and saying, you know, oh, so what did Dr. Pickering talk about? And you're like, I don't know, like I was listening, I wasn't listening. You know, I was half asleep for most of that lecture. So yeah, that's not good. That's not good. All right, so you see where some of the issues are. So even though the instructors knew that these were non-native speakers, like you couldn't mistake that for being a native speaker, right? There's enough information there pragmalinguistically to tell you that this is a non-native speaker. Even though they knew that, they consistently rated native speaker apologies higher. In other words, they didn't give them the benefit of the doubt, okay? So socio-pragmatic issues were the most common, right? This one says, even though the student apologized, I think the excuse that he woke up late is not worth sharing. He basically said he prioritized classes over this one, not a good reason, everyone is busy. The student only gives an excuse, doesn't take action to ask if it's possible to make another appointment. As an instructor, I hear excuses every day. I want students to be responsible and take action, right? So these are socio-pragmatic. They're not saying the language was terrible. They're saying these are inappropriate reasons, you know, to give me, right? But pragmalinguistics also was evident. So the fact that the email contains all sorts of grammatical errors that come from poor editing only makes it worse. You don't dash off and fail to edit an email when you're asking or really demanding special accommodations for no good reason, okay? Here, this was at the very least, catches me off guard. Like it's my job to make sure they get the notes when they can get them from their classmates. So this really upset this instructor that not only that at the very least, but also this note about the fact that nobody else took any notes in the lecture. So you see that the responses bring up both issues of socio-pragmatics and pragmalinguistics. So what apologies were rated highly? What is it that we're looking for pragmalinguistically and socio-pragmatically when we're looking for an apology in this situation? Hello, Dr. Smith. I'm so sorry about missing our appointment earlier. I would still like to talk to you about this matter. I understand if you do not wish to schedule another appointment, I'll stop by your office during your office hours. Again, I apologize for missing our appointment. Why is that better?
Talks about the actual appointment, you know.
Yeah, right. No excuses. No, you know, my dog, you know, ran off with my bike or something. Just literally, look, I missed you. I know I missed it. It's bad that I missed it. I completely understand if you don't want to make another special appointment with me. In that case, I'll just come to your office hours and take whatever I can get, right? So culturally, it's more acceptable to talk about what can be done when something already happened instead of why an assignment was submitted late. Full responsibility is more appealing to the professor than the reasons why the assignment was missed, right? So that's socio-pragmatics, obviously. Now, this is back to the one that's full of problems. Here, where there's no, you know, there's like inconsistencies in the grammar and so on. I was very annoyed just reading this. I would likely be a bit harsher than normal. It doesn't reflect a collegiate level of writing, thought, or respect. I prefer a specific request for a meeting date, time, rather than a statement. Lack of proper punctuation and grammar indicates a lack of interest in really succeeding and making a strong impression. So in this case, you know, this is more of a pragmalinguistic impression that they don't like. And you know, you basically what you're going to have, what she found in her study was that instructors ended up looking at both. But the interesting thing was pragmatics, like intonation in many ways, is so tacit. It's so something that we respond to because it's part of who we are, this universalistic perspective of how you behave appropriately, that the real problem is that while there's no consideration really being given, you know, the instructor isn't saying it's a non-native speaker. Okay, so what does Dr. Cheng suggest? She suggests that they can benefit from both implicit and explicit common semantic strategies, stance markers, so on. The activity that we did in advising, was that explicit or implicit? Implicit, no, it was implicit, good, yeah, because you didn't, it took you a second to work out what it was I was asking you that you would do, right? It was implicit because I never said to you, I never started by introducing you to a load of particular expressions about how you advise or anything else. You just had practice at advising, right? So she's saying that you can be both explicit and say, and you can be implicit, just giving them a lot of practice. Use the kind of scenarios. Understand that in the US academic system, students should be taught that there are finely tuned norms that they're going to struggle with if they don't know them. Explanations are okay, but it's more important to make up the work and make absolutely sure there's no inconvenience to the instructor. That's the absolute priority. Pragmalinguistics is important. Use formal salutations. You don't say, hey. You say, hello, Dr. Pickering, or, hi, Dr. Pickering, sincerely, best. Just because it's an email doesn't mean that you abandon all those salutation things that you would normally have when you're dealing with something that's hierarchical like that. Okay, this next one by Gail Nelson, Joan Carson, and two of their colleagues in Egypt was very interesting. What they were interested in was investigating refusals. And so they did a collaboration. Gail Nelson and Joan Carson were at Georgia State University, and their two colleagues were at a university in Egypt. So they decided they would do a sort of cross-cultural examination of speech acts of refusal in the two languages. So what they were interested in is, does the frequency of direct and indirect strategy use differ between Egyptians and Americans? Do Egyptians and Americans use different indirect strategies when they're refusing? And does the status of the interlocutor affect the strategy use? So depending upon who you're talking to, does that change your use of strategies? So they had 30 Americans doing refusals, 25 Egyptians, and they used spoken DCTs. Do you remember what a DCT was? Good. It's a discourse completion test. So they had them they gave them a scenario and said, what would you do in this scenario? And they were looking specifically at how many times there was a direct refusal, no, I won't, or no, I can't, and how many times there was indirect strategies and what indirect strategy. So, for example, a reason, I have other plans, a suggestion of willingness, maybe I'll do it next time, statement of regret, I'm so sorry. They sort of divided these up into pieces. And again, I'm not going to spend any detailed time looking at these studies because they're available to you. If you're interested in this one, it's available to you in DocShare. Go read it. If you were more interested in Cheng's, go read it. It's in DocShare. Okay, now this is impossible for you to read, but basically there's a problem with this study, and it was one of the reasons I included it. And I'm going to read some of this for you. In addition, when the Egyptian interviewees were asked to assess the appropriateness of situations, most of them noted that it would be appropriate to refuse in a particular situation, but that they personally would not refuse. Take a jump and we'll go here. The other two concerned refusing a person of higher status, in both instances a boss. Egyptians would find these situations very difficult to negotiate, and perhaps this difficulty accounts for the high frequency of reasons and so on. So let me show you, and I'll take you through what the problem is. For example, here's one of the situations. Here's one of the DCTs. You are a top executive in a very large accounting firm. One day the boss calls you into his office and he says, next Sunday, my wife and I are having a little party. I know it's short notice, but I'm hoping that all of my top executives will be there with their spouses. What do you say? Okay, so the invitation is by your boss, and you are told on the DCT that you have to refuse that situation. Okay.
I'll never do that.
How many of you would refuse that situation? None of you, right? I mean, I wouldn't refuse that situation. I'd be like, well, why would I, right? It's my boss.
Yeah.
So why is that a problem then? Why is the getting data from that a problem?
They're not realistic.
Good. They're not even close to being realistic, right? Because in the real world, they would never refuse that invitation. Not only they wouldn't, none of us would, right? So here's another example, which is even more bizarre. You're at your desk trying to find a report that your boss asked for. While you're searching through the mess on your desk, your boss walks over and says, you know, maybe you should try and organize yourself better. I always write myself little notes to remind me of things. Perhaps you should give it a try. Person of lower status refuses the suggestion.
And I think this is a really good suggestion in refusing, actually, you know.
But I mean, what? Who would refuse that? It's your boss, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if you're Egyptian or if you're American or if you're Korean. Would you refuse that? No, you'd say, why, thank you, boss. You know, what an awesome idea, you know. And then you'd wait for your boss to go away and you'd be like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
But you would never say, well, you know, I actually don't like wasting Post-it notes on giving small things, so I don't think so. Yeah.
No.
I mean, who would say that, right? So one thing, the reason I included this study is one thing that you want to be careful of when you do this, particularly if any of you are thinking you might want to do a thesis or a dissertation or anything about this, is being careful what you do, right? What you do has to be realistic enough to make it worth doing, okay? In that case, they got a lot of results about refusals, and you could read the paper, but once you see those kind of scenarios, you're like, do these results have any validity, right? I doubt it, you know, because basically, even though the Egyptian learner said, I would never refuse, the author said, well, do it anyway, refuse anyway. So what you get then is a real sociopragmatic problem, right? You're making them choose language to refuse in a situation they would never refuse it, all right? So you want to be really careful. So one thing that you can address this problem, you can simulate natural data, which is what Dr. Cheng did when she did the things. So one of my students did this in GSU. Nessa Wolfson had a bulge theory. And her bulge theory says that you will choose your pragmatic behavior depending upon your level of intimacy. So if it's my husband, I will say, go to the store, you forgot to get milk, okay? And if it's the other end of the bulge with someone that I've never met before and I don't care about, I might say, well, you were supposed to get the milk and you didn't. But if you've got someone in the middle, in the bulge, so people that you sort of know or you have some kind of relationship with, you'll try harder, okay? So in other words, your speech behavior is similar on each end. One, because they're a complete intimate, so you can say anything you want to them. And one, because they're a complete non-intimate, so you can say anything you want to them. They're a stranger or someone you'll never see again. And then there's all this speech behavior in the middle that, you know, you negotiate because maybe they're your boss or maybe they're your friend or maybe, and so you sort of try harder, is what she did. So relationships, put in other terms, the more status and social distance are seen as fixed, it's easier. So if social status is, a relationship is either very intimate or complete strangers, it's easier to work out what to do than if they're in the middle. So I had a student at Georgia State who decided she was going to test this. It was a great little study. She sent out emails to her family and friends, and the activity sounded real. What she said to them was that they should get up on Arbor Day. Does anyone want to get up with her on Arbor Day and plant trees in Atlanta at 8 a.m.? What she gave them was just a time, but not a place. So if someone actually said, yes, I'd like to come with you and plant trees at 8 a.m. in the morning on a very hot day, she would then say, well, actually, this is an experiment. So no one could actually go to the park. And then what she did was send this email as though it was a real email, a real request, out to all her family, friends, and work colleagues, and to match the bulge, right? So she asked people that she was very close to, strangers is basically people at her husband's work, and then sort of a bunch of friends and stuff in the middle. And she was hoping to see that it would support the bulge theory, that the language used on either end would be similar, and the language in the middle would be more diverse. That's not what she got. What she got was everybody just said no. And nobody really seemed all that bothered about how they told her no. It didn't matter whether they were at the intimate end or the not intimate end or somewhere in the middle. They basically said, yeah, no. So it was a great study because it looked real. You really, and of course, what was interesting was out of the 50 people she sent it to, everyone said no.
Wow.
So she never had to tell anyone that that it was an experiment. But it was a lovely way of testing the theory, right? Of saying, pretending something is real and getting that. Now we didn't get the results we expected, and that may have been for a variety of reasons. We didn't ask enough people, whatever. But the point was, that's how you get to do that's one way that you can do it if you're interested in doing speech act theory. Okay, the final speech act one we're going to look at is Boxer and Pickering, which, as I said, Diana Boxer is the daughter of Nessa, so that makes me the granddaughter of Nessa Wolfson, the woman that did the bulge theory. And but what we were interested in was indirect complaints. So if you look at EFL textbooks, they spend a lot of time talking about direct complaints. So they say, if you've got a fly in your soup, this is how you say. You say, waiter, this is terrible, I've got a fly in my soup. Or if you go to the dry cleaners and you come back and there's a big rip in your clothes, what do you say? Mr. Dry Cleaner, you must give me that. And this is what happens in ESL textbooks. What we know, though, is that compared to indirect complaints, we rarely use direct complaints. So we're much more likely to do an indirect complaint, meaning if Shehan is pissed off with me, he's way more likely to tell Jay than he is to me, right? So if he says, God, she's just went on and on and on tonight, I thought she'd never stop and we'd never go home, that is an indirect complaint. Okay, it has nothing, I'm the one that he's complaining about, but it has nothing to, he doesn't talk to me about it. We do this all the time. I'm sure you can, if you think that, you can remember the last time you did this today, right? I talked to my sister on the phone and I was complaining about my husband, right? So that's an indirect complaint, right? Instead of complaining to the person. Now, often we do it as something that's phatic. Communication. Do we know what phatic communication? Okay, so phatic communication, Diego, means communication just to make everybody feel good. It's not information. Okay, so phatic communication means you're building a relationship. So an example of an indirect complaint that's phatic communication would be if you're in a super long line at the supermarket, for example, or the post office, and you've been stuck in this line for ages, and you say, the person in front of you turns around to you and says, God, how long are we going to be in this line, right? That is phatic communication. It's not information, it's rapport building. It's to get you to say, I know, can you believe we've been here an hour and a half? It's to make everybody bond, right, a little bit better. We do that a lot. Okay, I was just renewing my driving license last week, and I was in there for 3 hours at Greenville, FYI. So anybody that's renewing their license in Greenville, God help you. And so every time the little button, you know, you had to pick a number. Every time the little machine turned over, we were all like, yay, because there was another number, you know. So that kind of thing is phallic communication. We were interested in whether that appeared in textbooks because that is way, way more common than direct complaints. And what we found was that American and British textbooks focused exclusively on direct complaints. There was no discussion of how a language learner might create an indirect complaint, right? This was interesting because when Cambridge Advanced English, I took 2 of their textbooks. I asked them to send me sample textbooks. They sent me 2. When they read the article, they refused to give me permission to cite the textbooks. Yeah, because they didn't realize I was going to say something not very nice. So the American textbooks gave Diana did the American textbooks and I did the British ones. The American textbooks, the information is there, and you can see this in the article that she has put up. But the American textbooks, when they found out what I was doing, they said, no, you can't put it in there. Huh. So that's just a little aside. So what we did after we'd gone through, we'd said, well, you know, this is a huge gap in the literature. We took some examples from spontaneous speech. These were examples from Diana. So we had 2 female students sitting in a large class. The professor is lecturing in the front of the room, using a microphone and occasionally laughing into it. So student A, Jade, turns to student B, She-Hun, and says, God, he's got the most annoying laugh. And She-Hun says, yes, and that mic doesn't help matters much, right? So essentially, if you have an indirect complaint, the most common responses are agreement, reassurance, or commiseration. So in this case, it's what? Agreement, right? But some international students get this really, really wrong. Like, they don't understand what the point of the communication is in the first place. So they don't understand that what the person is looking for is just an agreement. Then we present the indirect complaint without responses and ask the students to discuss possible responses. So in this case, it would be, you know, boy, this line is so slow. And then we say to the learners, what would you say? So, She-Hun.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, good. And that's pretty much all you need, right? Then we present samples for practice and feedback. So a female receptionist at the dentist's office complains to a male patient about how they are tearing down, excuse me, not teaching down, tearing down all the historical buildings in the neighborhood. So she says, oh, can you hear all that work out there? That's another old house that they're tearing down. Huh?
That's a pity.
Yeah. So you might say something like, yeah, that's a pity. It's horrible that they're taking these things down. Yeah, and that's all. So you're teaching these essential, oh, that was it. You're teaching, it was probably good. You're teaching these kind of essential conventionalized responses to learners. So that last article is really a direct idea of how you incorporate pragmatic instruction in a class, in a classroom, in this case with indirect complaints. Because there's nothing in the materials on indirect complaints, if you don't do it as the teacher, the students never do it. right? So it's something that you have to think through. Okay. Tell me questions or comments about the Speech Act work. Yeah, Jay.
About, I was like reading some of Casper's
Yes,
ideas about conversational analysis, about like this is the way you can actually get some authentic data. Because in my master's, I did written DCT, and I compare like Iranian apology way of like, responding to this. Like I have like that discourse completion test, and there were like scenarios, and then they had to rate on a Likert scale.
Yeah, Likert scale, yeah.
One to 5 being highly polite and highly impolite. And there was a comment part, like they have to provide some, like, because that rating would be like really, really not authentic. So I add myself a comment part, like you provide like, what would you say, like, I mean, why do you think it is polite? Why do you think
it's impolite, and what would you say? Right.
But I still think the thing that I did was not really authentic. I mean,
Right.
this is not a real situation for them.
Yeah.
But then I wanted to just, replicate the study with real authentic data, like putting them in a situation. And I was like, I was wondering if this is like possible ever, like, because that would be like a really, really hard task to gather. And to put this.
So why would that be a problem? Why has she got a problem if she decided she wants to do it using just natural data?
Well, you don't have the agreement from the participants to.
Actually, that's not a problem in this state. Only one person has to know. But what's the real problem?
Final scores and everything, or?
How often do you hear a refusal?
Yeah.
Yeah, hardly ever, right? I mean, people don't like to refuse.
Mm-hmm.
So given a bunch of options, they'll say yes, right? So you've really got to set up a supposed natural situation in which they are likely to refuse. Now that was what was so clever about my student study, because it did look like a real situation, and everybody did refuse, because they didn't want to be planting trees in 95 degrees in Atlanta, right? So that was great, but that's the only way she could get 50. Otherwise you could be there for the rest of your natural life, right? Hoping to God that you're going to get another refusal, and waiting desperately until you can write notes on another refusal that you get. So if you really have to try and be as clever as possible. You're absolutely right. One of the worst ways is a written DCT, because people say this is a written DCT. They're like, well, I guess this is what I would say. And in fact, who knows if that's what they would actually say, right? So it is a problem. So you have to try and get a little more creative. Now, a colleague of ours, Nancy Bell, who's into humor, does humor, wanted to know what people's reactions were to really bad jokes. So she went around telling, she had like 3 really terrible jokes. I mean, awful jokes. For one reason or another, one was sort of horribly sexist, one was just a really bad joke, and one was something else. And she went around seemingly genuinely telling these jokes. So she could get people's genuine reaction to a really bad joke, right? So she pretended that, and Dr. Hurtado did the preface for her book, and he said, the bravest thing she did was go around pretending that she really thought these were good jokes, right? Whereas in fact they were awful, and she was just doing it for the thing. So yeah, So that, you know, you have to be clever, and you have to look at, you know, the Nelson study is not particularly clever, right? Because, you know, it uses situations that, at least some of the situations are unclear, and it uses issues that would never happen in real life. Now, Dongmei Chang's study, she actually picked something that's realistic. Students do email you with, you know, and so she had some of them done and some real emails. And so she actually had an experimental setup that matched the data that she received. Whereas the DCTs that were done in Egypt didn't. Yeah, and that was a problem.
So you're suggesting if we can actually back up, like for example, use written DCT plus some sort of like interview and stuff, like, you know, use different data collection.
Yeah, that's one you can triangulate. Yeah, by using different, that's called triangulation. But really what you have to think of very carefully is the method I'm using, does the method I'm using match as well as possible the data I want to get? You know, so first of all, written DCTs are not the best things. Spoken DCTs, if you look at the literature, spoken DCTs do better than written DCTs. Second of all, if I'm using DCTs and I give a scenario, is it a meaningful scenario? You know, and hence so with the Nelson et al. Study, it really wasn't in some cases. So it's more a question of saying, what am I trying to find out? And does my data collection method even remotely stand a chance of finding out some real answers to that question? You know, you can do DCTs about anything, right? Which, and hence pragmatics as a field, second language pragmatics is falling over itself with speech act research because it's so straightforward. You just say, oh, I'm going to do a written DCT. I have 60 learners in my Japanese school. I'm going to get them all to answer the DCT, or if it's Attilio, he says, I'm going to get all my Italian learners to respond to this DCT, and whoop, I got myself an article, whoop, right? But, you know, that's great if the DCT, you know, has been worked out properly and everything, you know, but if it hasn't, then, you know, not the best plan. I mean, but consequently, the SLA literature is just replete with people doing speech act research at DCTs. Yeah. Any other questions?
Oh, that's nice. Interesting. But I was just going to say, could you repeat the implicit and explicit?
Yes. So
I want to make sure I have those.
yes. So the implicit is what you did with the advising game. All I said was, here's an activity, have at it, right? And then you sat there for 10 minutes giving advice to each other, right? So in order to give that advice to each other, you had to use some appropriate pragmalinguistic, language and so on. But I didn't explicitly say to you before you start. Now, explicit instruction, Diego, would be if I said, okay, how do you do advice giving? What are some of the pragmalinguistic ways in which you give advice? And before you did anything, I put up on the board, you know, could you, would you, will you, and then you practice the activity, right? Then you know exactly what you're doing, and you're supposed to be explicitly practicing the information that I put on the board. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So does explicit have to come before implicit can take place?
No. Well, that's an empirical question. No, in the sense that you did the activity without any explicit instruction, right? As learners would do. Learners, you could just give them that activity and said, have at it, right? So you don't, and then later, afterwards, if I want, I could then just say, thanks very much, great activity, goodbye. So it's entirely implicit. Or I could say, what were you doing there? What kind of language did you use? So I move it from the implicit to the explicit. But it's clear that for pragmatics, I mean, research suggests, as the early slide suggested, that explicit is better. Yeah. And you sort of got a taste of that by the fact I said, what are you doing? You're all like, talking, learning some language, you know, like, you know, but not saying, oh, I'm learning how to use the right language to give advice. Now you've done all this and you've done the activity, what are some of the constraints of an activity like that? I mean, it's good in the sense that it's good to do something, right, in pragmatic speech acts, but what's the downside of that activity?
I would say that from the student's learning perspective, it's too much all at once for them to know what the proper way or the correct way to
Okay, so one issue is there's loads of different ways to give advice, and you know what ones should they be focusing on? Good. Okay, and one of the ways we now solve that problem is by using corpora. So by getting huge things of language, written and spoken groups of language, and saying, how do most people give advice most of the time? So we can prioritize the learners. There is a million different ways that you can give advice, but here's the 3 that most native speakers use most of the time. So good, that's one thing. Just randomly chucking a load out there is not necessarily as effective as focusing. Yeah.
I also was thinking in own experience because in Spanish we have different dialects, okay? So this is a chaos. So I use that because I want to share with my student what kind of a strategy work in most of the places. Because
yes.
For example, this morning I was teaching verbal courtesy, okay, in a restaurant. So I spent like 2 weeks trying to create one specific activity in order to, okay, just be familiar with a couple of sentences or tongue word in order to request meal, this and everything in a restaurant, but I need this word in all the dialect, and it is quite difficult. And also, if I'm use some kind of a speech act from like real, right? It's difficult because my students, they are beginners.
Yeah.
So I have to deal with, they don't know this kind of structure, they will ask me about modal verb, I'm planning to introduce later.
Right.
Very difficult.
Right. Okay, good. So again, you're arguing for a more constrained activity. There's one other really big problem. Anyone?
I think it's like, you know, if you want to teach, if you teach them explicitly, you can teach them faster. You can go to the point and like providing that implicit materials. Like, I mean, they may not really understand what you want from them. You know, if you don't say this after the activity.
So in other words, yeah, you're saying that you should put into place the noticing hypothesis, right? So you should say, here's what we're doing and why we're doing it. Notice that that's how you do it. There's one other issue.
Is it that they don't know how to do it unless you tell them how to do it in the first place? Like, how can I
Think about what else matters when you're doing any pragmatic speech act.
The context?
Yes. What specifically about the context?
It's like you need to provide authentic context, or
Right. Well, because what's the problem? What specifically about the context might change?
The cultural aspects, the cultural.
Yeah. But where could a non-native speaker mess up? Who are they talking to?
another non-native. So I'm just like, I'm like him. In this case, like you mean.
Yes. So
Like Amanda can actually help.
well, Amanda Kay, She-Hun, and you are all exactly the same on a power, imposition, relationship level,
There's no
right?
social distance.
Yeah, the social distance is exactly the same. That
All
none of you are in a quote, what we would call quote unquote high stakes situation. right?
Right.
So this is great. You had fun, you did some pragmatic practice, but this is exactly where a potential problem lies in terms of teacher-induced error. Because you might then think, oh, well, I can go say that to anybody, right? But in fact, if you were giving advice to, I mean, for certain people, they don't even want your advice, right? It's not even appropriate for you to give them any advice. And the other thing might be that that you would change your pragmalinguistics depending upon if the person was a higher status than you or the same sex. So whenever you do these kind of activities in the classroom, if you only rely on doing it in the classroom, realistically in the classroom where you're all the same level, that's great, but then that's a gap, right? That then leaves a gap, which if the materials in your classroom don't deal with, somehow you need to try and deal with, okay? Like what's appropriate and what's inappropriate with different things. Well, I've decided that you've quite had enough. It's been 2 hours, and so I am gonna, we have a short part on the cooperative principle, which is up in the doc share. The PowerPoint is up, but I'll do it next week, right at the beginning. I'll just take a 20-minute slot right at the beginning of next week, and we'll talk about it because I think we've done enough. Don't you? Yeah, okay, good. All right, so thanks very much, everyone, and we'll see you next week. I'll put some comprehension review questions up for you tomorrow. Okay?
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, Atilia, you
Bye-bye.
done?